Winter rose slowly over Frostwell Hollow, brushing a pale silver across the rooftops, as though an old soul were smoothing a trembling hand over the world. In that quiet hour before the chimneys woke, before human voices claimed the morning Elowen Mirewood stepped into the snow with the deliberate softness of someone trying not to disturb a dream. Her boots left small, neat impressions behind her, each one filling gently with drifting powder. Beside her, Bran trudged with the weary dignity of an aged warrior, and Lyra glided like a pale wisp, her breath a fragile cloud dissolving into the cold. Elowen's fingers were tucked into Bran's scruff for warmth, but also for courage. Courage was something she wore like an undershirt, thin, patched, and often hidden. She couldn't recall when she first began walking the dogs alone at dawn. It felt like the world had always required this of her, as though the silence before daylight had chosen her specifically to carry it. And she obeyed, because the silence was kinder than most people she knew. The village tolerated her, but only barely. Mornings were safer. Fewer eyes watched her, and fewer tongues wagged. It wasn't that they spoke loudly. Frostwell Hollow excelled at quiet cruelties, but the words found her anyway. Slipping through cracked door frames, drifting through bakery windows, lodging under her ribs like bits of broken ice. Strange girl. Odd family. Talks to her dogs more than she talks to people. She pretends they understand her. She pretends too much. She tried not to hear them. But children have a way of memorizing the shape of a wound even before they understand it. Shame had become a familiar ripple in her chest, a sensation she endured without complaint because complaints only made people look at her longer. Bran leaned against her when they passed the bakery, as though he sensed her growing smaller. Elowen bent to adjust his scarf, the one she had knitted from leftover wool, in mismatched winter colors. She whispered, "Good boy," and his tail thumped once. Lyra trotted ahead, pausing now and then to look back at them, her eyes bright enough to make the snow around her seem even colder. By the time they reached the edge of the woods, dawn had unfurled fully. The trees stood in solemn ranks, branches heavy with frost, and the air carried that powdery hush unique to winter mornings. Most villagers avoided these woods until noon, when the sun cut the shadows. Elowen entered without hesitation, the dogs slipping through the underbrush like they belonged to it. She felt safer here. The woods listened without judging. They accepted her quiet nature, her awkwardness, her smallness. They held her secrets without gossiping, as she brushed her fingers along Bran's back. A faint shimmer lifted briefly from his furs, so faint she could pretend it wasn't real. To pretend helped her breathe easier. To pretend meant she didn't have to explain. The dogs moved in a synchronized pattern, sensing her thoughts before they fully formed. It wasn't magic, at least she refused to call it that. Magic was something people feared. What Elowen felt was more like an echo, an old memory returning to her through creatures who trusted her more than humans ever had. Still, she kept this hidden. Some truths were safer buried under snow. She followed their usual path, winding between tall pines, until the village sounds were swallowed completely. Somewhere deeper in the woods, a distant howl stretched across the valley. Long and mournful, but neither Bran nor Lyra reacted with alarm. Their ears twitched, nothing more. Elowen paused, sensing a familiar tightening in her chest knot. Fear, exactly. But anticipation, like a promise whispered in a language she could almost understand, before she could think more on it. A soft crunch broke the stillness. She turned her head, expecting a deer, and found Rowan Thornfield standing on the old wooden bridge that crossed a half-frozen stream. He had seen her before many times, in fact, but always from a distance, always with a guarded gentleness in his gaze. This morning he held something small in his hand. Rowan didn't step closer. He seemed carved from the same quiet as the landscape, tall and lean, bundled in a worn coat dusted with frost. His expression was unreadable, but not unkind. Elowen froze, unsure of what he wanted. She didn't fear him. Rowan was too soft-spoken for that, but she didn't know what to do with someone who didn't. Avert their eyes or cross the street to avoid her. He placed the small object on the bridge railing and gave her a nod, the kind that felt respectful rather than pitying. Then, without a word, He continued across the bridge and disappeared. Down a path toward the lumber mill, Elowen waited a few breaths before approaching. A tiny wooden dog figurine sat on the railing, carved with simple lines but crafted with undeniable care. Its posture resembled Bran's. She cupped it carefully, her breath catching in her throat. No one had given her anything just for the sake of kindness. She held it gently, afraid it might vanish if she blinked too hard. Lyra pressed her nose to Elowen's palm, snuffling the wood, and Elowen smiled a small, startled smile that pulled at muscles she rarely used. For a moment the world felt softer, as though winter itself had paused to watch something tender unfold. She tucked the figurine inside her coat and continued walking. Her steps felt a little lighter. The woods grew deeper, the path narrowing to a ribbon between the trees. The dogs trotted ahead, leaving faint trails in the snow. Elowen followed them until the air shifted. A peculiar silence settled, too sudden to complete. Bran stopped, ears pricked. Lyra stood perfectly still. Elowen's breath fogged in slow spirals as her heart thumped once. Then again, something felt present watching, but she sensed no threat. She stepped forward, and a large shadow moved between the trees. A wolf. Its coat brushed with silver, eyes catching pale light like lanterns, but it did not snarl. It did not stalk. It dipped its head the slightest degree, acknowledging her as though she were someone older, someone known. Elowen swallowed hard. She whispered, "Not today," her voice as soft as a falling flake. Her hand brushed Lyra's side in reassurance, though she wasn't sure whether she was comforting the dog or herself. The wolf held her gaze for one lingering heartbeat before retreating into the trees with graceful inevitability. She exhaled, unaware she'd been holding her breath. On the way back toward town, the world regained its ordinary rhythm. Crows called overhead. A distant door slammed. Smoke curled from chimneys, yet Elowen felt a new tension coiling under the surface of the morning, as though something unseen was drawing closer, threads tightening, converging. When they reached the outskirts of Frostwell Hollow, she sensed eyes on her again. Rowan stood at the mill's entrance, watching quietly. He didn't wave or approach, just offered a faint nod, shy, almost reverent. She hesitated and nodded back. That tiny exchange warmed her more than the wool coat she wore, but warmth had a way of attracting the cold. A group of women near the well fell silent as she passed, their glances quick and sharp. One whispered to another, always wandering in the woods. "Strange child," another murmured. "Her family keeps too many secrets." Elowen kept her chin down, focusing on Bran's steady gait and Lyra's soft steps. She wished she could shrink smaller, dissolve into the winter air, become as invisible as the quiet kindness Rowan had shown. The dogs pressed close to her. They always knew when she needed them. By the time she reached her small cottage at the edge of the village, the morning had turned brighter, harsher. Frost glittered on the eaves. Elowen paused at the door, the wooden figurine still tucked in her pocket. She touched it once more before stepping inside. She didn't know it yet, but that simple carving was the first fracture in the wall she had built around herself. A quiet gesture from a quiet boy who saw her when most people didn't see her at all. It would matter later more than she could imagine. For now. She simply closed the door behind her, unaware that Rowan's gaze lingered a moment longer before he finally returned to work. Unaware that the wolf in the woods had paused too, listening to something only it could hear. Unaware that the threads of her life had begun, imperceptibly, to pull tighter. The day moved forward. But something in the air had changed, subtle, like the first crack of ice before a river breaks open. The village didn't notice. Elowen didn't understand, but the dogs sensed it, and the woods sensed it. And somewhere in the snow-draped hills, a distant howl rose in a tone that sounded almost like longing. The story had begun to shift, though the world remained still, holding its breath for what would come next. The morning after the storm's whisper passed, Frostwell Hollow awoke wrapped in a brittle frost, the kind that made each breath visible and every footstep a delicate echo on frozen earth. Elowen moved with the same careful rhythm, her fingers still clutching the wooden dog figurine Rowan had left. It felt heavier now, as though carrying a silent promise. she was only beginning to understand. The village was quieter than usual. Windows shuttered tighter, voices lowered to wary murmurs. Word had traveled fast. Wolves had been seen closer than ever, prowling the edges where children once played freely. Fear clung to the air like smoke, weaving through the narrow streets and curling beneath every whispered conversation. Elowen felt it too, that prickling weight of suspicion folding into the familiar loneliness. Eyes watched her with a new sharpness, as if her presence alone summoned the wild shadows. She kept her gaze low, dragging her feet through the fresh snow, her two dogs moving close, sensing the change beneath her skin. At the well, a cluster of villagers gathered, their faces pale and drawn. The women who once whispered had grown bolder. One stepped forward, her voice brittle and accusing. "Your dogs lead the wolves here. Your family's secrets have cursed us." Elowen's throat tightened. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words tangled, fragile and fragile as frost. Lyra pressed against her leg, grounding her in the moment, a soft reminder that she was not truly alone. Bran's steady presence beside her was a shield against the cold judgment. Before she could retreat, figure stepped between the crowd and her, a silent guardian with a quiet strength. Rowan Thornfield, his breath misting in the cold air, his eyes steady and unyielding. Without a word, he placed a hand lightly on Elowen's shoulder, a gesture of protection and faith that spoke louder than any defense. The crowd faltered, uncertainty flickering like a candle's flame. Rowan's silent stand shifted the balance, though no victory was claimed that day. Elowen nodded once, a small flicker of gratitude stirring within her guarded heart. That night, under a sky choked with stars and heavy with frost, Elowen slipped from her cottage with Bran and Lyra. The village slept. Unaware of the quiet journey she undertook, Rowan, restless and compelled, followed at a cautious distance, his breath shallow with curiosity and concern. They moved deeper into the woods where moonlight scattered across ice-laden branches. The wolves awaited them, a silent congregation, their eyes glinting with ancient knowledge and quiet sorrow. At the center, the lead wolf stood, larger and more scarred than the others, its breaths ragged and uneven. Elowen approached slowly, her heart a fragile rhythm against the vast hush of night. She knelt, hands trembling as they reached out, bridging the space between human and wild. Her touch was a whisper, a balm, and beneath her fingers, the wolf's tension began to melt like ice under the first thaw. The shimmer she had glimpsed before bloomed into radiant waves, spilling warmth into the cold. The wolf's breath evened, and its eyes softened, reflecting a memory only Elowen could awaken. Around them, the pack bowed their heads, silent chorus of reverence and trust. Rowan stepped forward then, no longer hidden, bearing witness to the delicate miracle unfolding. He watched as Elowen, small and resolute, became something beyond fear or misunderstanding, a bridge between worlds. Suddenly, the storm returned with violent force. Howling winds, tearing through the branches, snow blurring vision and sound. The lead wolf faltered, panic flickering in its eyes, threatening to unravel the fragile calm. If it broke, the pack would surge toward the village in a wild, desperate stampede. Elowen's breath caught. She rose, steady, despite the storm's rage, and moved closer, unflinching in the face of chaos. Bran and Lyra flanked her, guardians in the tempest. Time slowed, the storm's roar a distant hum as snowflakes danced like fragile spirits caught in a sacred moment. With a trembling hand, Elowen pressed her forehead to the wolf's muzzle, grounding both herself and the creature in a shared silence. A luminous pulse flowed between them, weaving strength and surrender into a single thread. The wolf's muscles loosened, panic dissolving into quiet trust. As the storm's fury waned, the pack retreated, leaving behind a hush deeper than before. Rohan approached Elowen then, awe softened by something tender and unspoken. In that charged stillness, no words were needed, only the fragile connection of two souls who had seen each other through shadow and light. Dawn spilled slowly across the village, and with it came change. The townsfolk emerged to find the wolves departing peacefully, guided by Elowen's steady hand. Fear gave way to tentative respect, apologies murmured like fragile prayers. Elowen accepted them with a quiet grace, not for their sake, but for the healing she dared to begin within herself. Rowan's presence became a gentle constant, no grand declarations, only the language of small gestures, a shared glance, a hand held briefly. The warmth of company in a world that often felt unbearably cold. Together they navigated the fragile beginnings of trust, the slow bloom of something unspoken but deeply felt. And so, the winter's tale whispered on, of a girl who carried secret light in her hands, of wolves who remembered their kinship, of a village learning to see beyond fear. In the quiet moments between snowflakes and shadows, there was hope. For sometimes, the most profound strength lies not in loud triumphs, but in the gentle courage to be seen and to see others in return. If you find solace in these whispered tales, in the slow unfolding of hidden truths and quiet hearts, then stay with us. Subscribe and let us wander together through stories that warm the coldest nights and remind us that every soul carries a secret worth discovering.